Welcome to lesson 3 of using God's story in evangelism. I'm so glad you guys are tuning in for this class online. It's a little different than the in-class discussion, but I wanted to open up just for a little review of what we have talked about so far that hopefully you have seen and watched and engaged in the material of lesson 1 and 2. So lesson 1 was about God's call to evangelism, that God calls all Christians, believers, to share their faith with people who do not believe. And so if you want to look at the biblical basis for why we have to share and why we should be sharing, and the fact that all Christians, not just a special subsect of Christians, are called, please check out lesson 1 as we talk about evangelism. And then lesson 2 was all about the power of story, and about stories have the power to draw us in and explain things in a way that can capture our imagination, if you will. And furthermore, that everyone has a story. Everyone has a story that explains their life, or they try to explain their life, and is made up of their experiences, their struggles, their joys, of things that they kind of define themselves as. And so, what's amazing is that everyone's story actually only makes sense, or we should say makes better sense or most sense, when it comes under God's story. And we talked about how we're going to use God's story, his grand narrative of redemptive history, to help talk about with people how their stories come under his story, how there's a natural bridge there. This is what using God's story in evangelism really means. And so we talked about how God's story is made up of these four-part movement of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. And so for the rest of these lessons, we're going to be talking about each part of this story and talking about how it can be used to address people where they are and what they're experiencing, what they're longing for, and how they see themselves. And so today, we're going to be talking about creation. And so we dive into the creation count and what it means that God created us. So let's talk about creation. So the goal of this lesson is to understand how the story of biblical creation can explain much of our experiences and existence. So when we're talking about creation, we can first ask the question, where does any good story start? Well, at the beginning, right? Unless you're Quentin Tarantino, usually good stories start right at the beginning. They lay the basis, the groundwork for what comes after. So when we think about that, that creation account is the beginning of the story, of our story. So why would what we believe about creation matter to how we understand existence? And what influence would it have on how we see the world? Well, think about that. How we see about creation influences how we see the world, and it matters because it sets the whole belief system we might hold to. If you believe in a naturalistic scientific kind of explanation for creation or for why existence happens how it happens, then that really determines how you see life, how you see humanity, how you see the world. It determines whether you allow the possibility for there to be a God, or for the ability to be supernatural things, or anything like that. It determines so much about how we see and experience existence. It sets the tone, and it even sets the purpose and where the trajectory in which people are going. How we see creation matters and can greatly influence the whole story. How it started really determines the purpose, determines who we are, how we've been made, what we've been made for, and all those big questions of life. So let's talk about the creation count. So typically, when Christians talk about the creation count, they go straight to Genesis 1 and 2, about how God created it. It's a great way to talk about creation. It gives the beginning of the story. And so let's just run through some questions as we reflect on Genesis 1 and 2. If you're not familiar with Genesis 1 and 2, please pause this video and take a quick second to read through these first two chapters of the Bible, because it sets the groundwork of who we are and who God is. It goes from in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It talks about how God made humanity, humans, male and female, Adam and Eve. He made them in his own image. It talks about how he gave a man and woman together to be husband and wife, and how they were both naked in the garden serving him, but they were not ashamed. It was still paradise at this point in time in this creation account. It runs that whole gamut in these first two chapters of Genesis, and sets the basis for so much of what we believe. And so we can ask the question, what does the creation account in Genesis show us about God? Think about that. What does Genesis 1 and 2 show us about God? Well, here are some things, and hopefully you might even be able to pull more details out, but it starts with in the beginning God. So before time and space and creation existed, God was there. And so it shows us God is transcendent. He's outside of time and space. The creator, is not part of his creation. And so this God that we speak of is bigger than all that is around us, and he encompasses, and he stands outside of all of his creation. But also, it tells us he's with us. He's immanent. He cares for Adam and Eve. He makes Adam and Eve in a personal way. And so when we see these two-fold facets of this creator God, that he is bigger than his creation, but yet he's intimate with it, personally creating Adam and Eve. So there's at least two things it tells us about God. It also tells us God is the creator. He is the almighty one who made all that is, and not all that is exists because he made it. And so God is the creator. He is the owner, the king of all of creation. We can think of other things that tells us about God, but those are the big aspects. That God's creator, he owns it. He made it good. What does this creation tell us about creation account itself? When we read it, should we pick up about creation? Well, I already kind of mentioned it. But if you read Genesis 1, there's that constant refrain that happens again and again. God said let it be, and it was good. That creation is good in itself. That God actually made creation good. Which means that we don't think of creation in material aspects, our bodies and what's around us, in this kind of dualistic Greek kind of philosophical way, uh, of thinking that the spiritual is good and the physical is bad. No, God created the physical and it was good. So let's think about how humans were made in the creation account. Think about that. Well, they were made personally, right? God molded Adam from the dust and then breathed the spirit into his mouth, into him. Eve was made personally by God out of Adam's rib, out of his side. We see how in the creation account it describes humans were made in God's image to have dominion. This is fundamentally different than the other creation, and it leads to implications about who we see ourselves to be. Because it leads right into the next question of, for what purpose were humans made? Well, humans were made fundamentally to have a relationship with God. We were made to be in relationship under God, to image him on this earth. We also see that humans were made to rule, to have dominion over God's creation, is in relationship with God. Humans were made to have a relationship with each other, to husband and wife together. At the very least, we see this from this. And so we see these purposes that humans were made, and that it gives us clues on to where we're going, and it actually probably speaks to some longings and desires we have in our own life. So what does it mean that God made humans in his image? What does it mean that humans were made in the image of God? Well, it means that we're supposed to reflect him, right? It's supposed to we're made for a relationship with God. We're made to be with God. We relate to God in this fashion, that there's some attributes of God that we can actually share in, that we're personal, that we have logic, that we have morals. These all are reflected in this image of God. Means that all humans, no matter who they are, where they are, when they have innate worth because we're image bearers of God. What does it mean that humans were to have dominion over all creation? Well, it means that we're given a task, we're given a job, we're given this ability to actually rule, have dominion over creation under God, yes, but we're given that kind of place of prominence in God's creation. We can talk about the significance of humans given a task in the creation account, that Adam was placed in the garden and told to work it and to keep it and to guard it. And we understand, oh, hey, work is not innately bad in and of itself. That actually humans are made to work. We're made to have job. We're made to have a task at hand. Again, maybe that can speak into these longings, desires, and things that might get off track later on when we talk about God's story. So that's the main creation count we can ask this thing. But there's other creation counts that we can go into. And so we can look at Acts 17:22 through 31, where Paul is speaking in Athens, and he's talking to these men, and he even mentions, hey, I went by this altar to the unknown God, and let me tell you, you guys don't know who this God is, but I'll tell you who is. And then he describes the God of Christianity, the God of the Bible. This God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything. Since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God, in the hope that they might feel their way towards him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of you, for in him we live and move and have our being, as some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think about the divine being as like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Now that goes into more of creation, but it talks about creation. It talks about the God of creation. So what does this passage tell us about this God of creation? Again, it emphasized that he's the creator. He's the Lord of heaven and earth. He made it and everything in it. And this God is bigger than anything that we try to put him into. He can't be confined to the temple. He can't be confined to his creation. He gave life to all humans and to everything. And not only that, but he's not some distant deity. He has allotted the boundaries and periods of time for everyone. And so he actually establishes where we live and where we were born into, all for the reason so that we should seek God, because again, he's not far off. He's closer than we think. What does this account tell us about humanity? Well, it tells us that we need God. We were made for God, that we need to repent, and that goes into the later aspects of God's story that we're going to get into the later weeks about the fall and redemption. But it's talking about what we were made for, to be in a relationship with God. And there's other creations count. We can go through many creation counts, but here's just one more, which is in Colossians 1:15 through 17, talking about Christ. But again, it's a creation account, because we've got to remember the whole Trinity was involved in creation itself. That he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Does this add any more details to the creation story? It emphasizes that he sustains all things. It emphasizes the purpose of creation was for his glory. It emphasizes the focus, which is God, Christ. This is what it focuses on, this creation count. And so it kind of helps us steer our minds about creation, while the pinnacle of God's creation is never about us. It's about who God is and the purpose he created us for. But when we talk about creation, it's good to think about some other creation stories. So what are some stories you've heard from people about how the world came into being, besides the Christian creation story? Well, maybe you've heard creation stories from a more scientific or naturalistic explanation, like the Big Bang, which is expressed devoid of God. The idea that some naturalistic explanation just naturally happened, where the world came into being, and explain how life started, all from these scientific explanations apart from God's working. Well, that's a story, and that leads to natural implications. Where does that story lead to? Well, it either leads to we have to define our own purpose and meaning in life because there's nothing outside of ourselves, or it leads to nihilism where we don't believe in anything. It leads to a place where we're grasping for hope in a place where maybe we just have to create hope for ourselves. And hopefully that's not uncharitable about what that worldview leads to, but that's one thing it might lead to. We might think of other um, cultures or religions and their creation accounts where maybe it's the pantheon of gods create out of something that's already there. And so we see also the distinctions of that we have in the Christian faith of God being distinct from creation can't be upheld in these other accounts. And so that leads to a conflating of the divine and the creation, and so which can lead to problems. But think about that. Just think about some other accounts you might have heard, and just think about where those naturally lead, because that's a good thing. And I exercise to think about how creation and what we think about creation naturally leads to a thought about what we think of life and what we think about who God is. And so it's good to think through those things. But the next part is, as we talked about in lesson 2, at the end of lesson 2, is that in each of these plot movements and with God's story as a whole, we can use this for evangelism. How can we do that? Well, people are looking for certain things. Maybe they have certain longings or certain desires, or they're experiencing things, maybe hardship or something along those lines, or they're hoping for things. And in those things that people are experiencing or longing for, hoping for, they all make sense when we place them under the framework of God's story. And when we do that, we can do these things where we can either seek to affirm why they feel something, we can challenge why they think that they something, and then we can offer the better story. And as we talked about in the class on Sunday evening, these are not hard and fast like things that you steps, because sometimes they blend into each other, and so it's hard sometimes from affirming and challenging not to also immediately go into offering a better story. But these flow back and forth. But these are just some ways to organize thinking through other worldviews and other ways of people trying to explain their existence through story. And if you want more detailed explanation of this, you can check out Telling a Better Story right here by Joshua. I think his last name is Chatra. I probably butchered that, but he goes into more detail of this process of affirming what we can affirm, what we can challenge, where it naturally leads, maybe where it actually reflects the Christian or God story, and then how do we can offer a better story. But we're going to just take an abbreviated kind of a version of that as we think through those movements, because I think we can do that really well. So the first big one maybe, is purpose and meaning. So when we think about purpose and meaning, we know that humans naturally look for meaning and purpose for their lives. So where do some people look for purpose and meaning? Think about that. Where do people look for purpose and meaning? Well, lots were mentioned in the class, but we talked about how they were looking for status, money, relationships, job, position, authority, success, achievements, family, and more. Some of these are good, but they look for these to give them purpose, meaning. And when we think about them, what the common factors of what all these have that make them fall short of providing for that purpose, meaning? Can you think of something that those all have in common? Well, they're all transient. They're all temporal. They're not eternal. They're not made to carry our whole purpose and meaning for life. Excuse me. But these all fall short because they can't hold our purpose and meaning. They can't provide that because they're not eternal. They will fade. They're temporal. They're transient. We could easily lose any of these at any moment. And so how could we put our meaning and purpose or try to find them in these things? But how could we affirm a person's quest for meaning and purpose? Think about that. How do we affirm that? Well, first of all, we can look at someone and say, yes, you are looking for meaning and purpose because you were made for a purpose. We don't believe that you were just made by happenstance, or you were actually made for a purpose, which means there's meaning for your life. Not just grand meaning, but in every day there's meaning. So we can affirm that longing, that desire. But then we can go right into challenging it. Say, where are you looking for these things? It falls short. Why? Because it's temporary, or it's transient, or it cannot bear the weight of your purpose and meaning. It might be, it's fleeting. You could lose it really suddenly. And so we challenge that and say, you look for meaning and purpose in all these things. Have you found it? Are you satisfied with it? Does it meet that longing? And if they're honest, hopefully they can go to that place where they recognize, no, it hasn't. It's recognizing, as Pascal put it, that God-shaped vacuum in every heart, that we're made for God, and our heart will be longing for God till we find rest in God, and that allows us to offer the better story. That we can offer the story that, hey, you were created by a personal God who loves you. You were created to have a purpose and a relationship to God. These longings that you felt for meaning and purpose, they can all be satisfied when you know that God made you for himself. And you're supposed to be in a relationship with him. He made you unique. He made you valuable. You have worth because he made you. You are loved because he loves you. And you're lovely because he loves you. So we get to offer that better story of who God is. Making us for his purpose. And there's other areas we can do this as well. Let's talk about pleasure and joy. The world can be one filled with pleasure and great experiences that we enjoy, that bring us joy. And how does a non-believing world explain this? Well, they just say, we're lucky, right? That I guess we have these pleasures, and so then they can really twist it, and then they make those joys and those pleasures the end all be all, and say, okay, we're just supposed to live for those. And so we can affirm this. We can say, yes, the world is filled with pleasures, and there's joys there, and we're supposed to enjoy this world, and we're supposed to enjoy this, but those are not the end all be all. And so it slips right into challenging, and we start to push back and say, these pleasures, these joys are not the end all be all of life. There's something more, there's something greater, and there's something that these joys are actually just signposts to. And that is right here, the better story. The creator God, is a good God, and he made creation good. And so these goodness of God actually the goodness of creation actually point to the goodness of God. And so these pleasures we experience, these joys, actually serve as those signposts pointing just to how good God is. And so we can start offering this better story of this creator God who creates creation good. We can talk about identity. And in class, some people found this one to be a harder one because it might be more philosophical. But how important is it in our day and age where people want to define themselves however they want? So how do people see themselves? Well, they see themselves as individuals. They see themselves connected to groups. There's this ironic tendency that I pointed out in our Sunday class about how people in a very individualistic time define themselves by what group they belong to, by what political party they are, by what organization they belong to, what Facebook group they associate with, and more. We identify ourselves by these associations. And then, what is humanity? That's a typo in your material. What is humanity? Well, we know humanity is created in the image of God, created with innate worth and value, made different than the other animals, made to have a relationship with God, made to rule and steward this creation he gave us. And that means that's why we're different from the rest of this world, the creature of this world at least. So when we're talking about identity, how can we affirm this? Well, again, we can affirm that longing, that need to identify yourself with something outside yourself, because we're not made to identify ourselves how we want. We can affirm that. We're made to identify ourselves by how God has identified ourselves, how God defines who we are, which immediately goes in challenging when we push back on how people identify themselves and say, is that who you are fundamentally at your core? Is that who you are? Is how you choose to identify yourself? Is that what makes you who you are? We challenge that. And then we offer the better story about how people can find their identity in a personal God who created them and defines who they are. And in all these things, we are offering a better story. We're pushing people to know who God is. And so hopefully just through these three kind of elements, and there's more we can go about a creation count we can go into, but you see in these three just little ways in which we can process through using God's story to speak to people about God's story, which opens up bridges to evangelism. Again, this is using creation. It works best when we use all God's story and really get into that redemption where we are offering or setting before someone the gospel of Jesus Christ and asking them to respond to it. But we see just through even these beginning movements how we can speak to people and what they're experiencing and what they long for, and hopefully point them to the better story, the great story of Jesus Christ and His salvation. God who made the people with a purpose and is going to, and bringing people back to Him. If you have any questions, please contact me as we go through this material. Hopefully you can think through creation a little bit more and think maybe some other categories where creation speaks to truth that you can use to confront people and their story. Thank you for joining us for this lesson 3. Tune in next week. Come in person on Sunday evenings as we dive into the next movement of God's story, which is the fall. Hope you guys have a great week and see you soon.